Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and recently I posted a real military vehicle walk-around video of a M4A3 Sherman tank that was out on public display. Well, while filming that video, there were several small little details and nuances that stood out to me that I found to be very, very unique, and these are the type of things that generally are missed by most people out there that are interested in not just tank modeling, but also fans of the Sherman tank in general. And to point out the obvious, this vehicle here is a late production M4A3 Sherman tank. Specifically, this one here was built by the Fisher plant back in May of 1944. This vehicle, once completed, was in this type of configuration with the VVSS suspension as well as with the 75mm gun. The vehicle does have a high bustle turret with the integral cheek armor as well as the oval loader satch. Being an M4A3, this vehicle would have been powered by the Ford GAA V8 gasoline engine. The vehicle also has plenty of late production features on it, like the single-piece panoramic view commander's cupola, the M34A1 gun mantlet, as well as the second generation main gun travelock. And that wraps up the basic info on this vehicle. However, where things get interesting is with the vehicle's current configuration. You see, this may be surprising to some people, but this vehicle here is not a World War II Sherman tank. Or I should say it's not currently in a World War II configuration. By this point here, this pattern of vehicle was quickly and rapidly becoming obsolete, being a 75mm equipped Sherman with the VVSS suspension. At this time, you had a large number of M4A3 E8 Shermans coming onto the scene, and you also had several other vehicles being retrofitted with the HVSS suspension, as well as also with the T23 76mm turret. And with the way mass production was with the United States, there were a large number of these vehicles still in the U.S. military inventory. Many of them would be upgraded, again with 76mm guns, specifically during the Korean War conflict, but most of them basically stayed in this type of configuration. Because there was such a large number of these vehicles still left in service, the military decided to keep them because they were still fully functional and operating vehicles. However, rather than issuing them to frontline main combat units, the vehicles were then relegated to other types of roles, which namely meant they were issued out to Army Reserve and Army National Guard units. Whereas these units here, they didn't exactly need the newest, bright, and shiny bit of equipment, but something like this here would have been able to fully satisfy their needs without any problems. And it is at this point in this vehicle's life is when the vehicle had the many modifications made to it that give us the current condition and state that the vehicle is in today. And it is in this configuration is how the M4A3 with the 75 ended its service life with the US military. So let's go ahead and delve into what was added to this vehicle in the 1950s time frame. When you're checking out a Sherman and you're trying to see if it was upgraded in the 50s, the first place you head to is the rear section, because this is really where the bulk, if not all, of the modifications were made. Alright, so I'll freeze the frame right here, and the first thing that should immediately jump at you is how plain and bare the rear armor plate section is on this particular vehicle. If anyone knows a thing or two about the A3, you'll know that the rear section here is cluttered with all sorts of bits of equipment, such as the rear folding rack, which is made out of stamped sheet metal, and the stamped plate steel spare track racks, which are located on either side right above the tracks. Starting with the rear rack, or the lack thereof one, for some reason that escapes me, when the vehicles entered into the 1950s Life Extension Program, one of the first things that were removed was the rear folding rack. However, by removing the rack, you would have also lost a bit of equipment that was still relatively important for the vehicle's maintenance, and that would have been the gun cleaning saves. You see, on the bottom portion of the rack, there are the provisions for mounting on the wooden rods that are used to telescope together and swab the barrel. Well, so what was done was when the rack was removed, they decided to take the provisions that were originally found on the rack and hard weld them directly to the rear portion of the plate. And that is what you see right here on either the left and right side. The brackets themselves are identical to the ones found on the rack and possibly were amputated from the racks. What's interesting about this is that the one on the right-hand side that you can see from this image here actually hinges downward, and that's how you put the rods in place. And that little zigzag piece of steel there locks into the threaded sections on the staves and keeps them in place. If I go to the opposite side here, you'll see what the mounts look like with that same zigzag present. If we swing around to the rear portion here of the mount, you'll see that this one here is in really good shape and, considering its age, held up very well. The one on the right-hand side, however, not so much. If we turn our attention to the top portion here, you'll see that part of the wall that's there to keep these staves in place is missing, and one of the protective wings for the swab is also absent. That portion of the wing is actually welded to that plate, and it's not uncommon for the whole unit to just rip out. I've even had this happen to me on several of my 1/6 scale ones when I was making them out of sheet metal. These pieces here are very frail and are very easily snagged, and it's not uncommon to see these gun cleaning stave mounts in this type of condition. And this is specifically true for vehicles that were in the National Guard and the Army Reserve during this era. Keep in mind, these vehicles were already obsolete, and the reservists and guardsmen didn't really care and keep up on maintenance if something broke off of, an old piece of equipment. The next bit of equipment that was removed on the rear area here was the spare track storage racks. Generally, there would have been one on the left and right hand side. However, when the vehicles went through this phase, both of these racks were removed. One of the racks was removed in order to make clearance for the telephone communication box, which was then added to the rear plate. And by the way, this vehicle does have evidence of that because we can see that there's this little hole drilled right here in the rear plate. And just like with the gun cleaning staves, they wanted to have the ability to secure on 6 spare track links to the vehicle's exterior, but do it in a way that's much more simplified compared to the original wartime spare track racks, which were welded to the rear portion of the tank. So it was decided to just simply relocate the spare track links, and rather than having them mounted on the rear, they decided to move them to the sides of the turret. And when I said before that this was going to be done in a very simplistic and brutally efficient way, I wasn't kidding. Rather than going with that nice stamped plate steel rack that was found on the World War II design, they simply just took threaded rods and welded them directly to the sides of the turret. In order to secure the track links in place, this stamped steel bracket was then just fitted over and then was secured in place with nothing more than a simple nut and a lock washer. And this is a modification that is a documented post-World War II mod and was one that was done to many, many Shermans during this period. In fact, if anyone is watching this video here, I'm pretty sure that you've seen the movie Kelly's Heroes, and if you did, the M4A3 vehicles that were sent to Yugoslavia, where of course the movie was filmed, had this procedure done to them as well, as you can see from this picture that is currently on the screen. Outside of those two major changes that were made to the vehicles, another subtle change involves the vehicle's tin work. On this particular vehicle, you can see that on the rear portion we have these mud guards that come down, and they are fastened to the side skirt mounts, which of course are present on all of these vehicles. The shape on these units here I've seen mostly on vehicles from the post-war era. However, they may be a design from very late in World War II. On the flip side, if we take a look at the front fenders, you'll see that there is this extender plate present on the leading edge of the bow fender. The extender plate is an adapter piece that's designed so that you can fit on the side skirts, which were World War II pattern. However, as you can see, the rear section on the World War II design was very different compared to the way that we see it on this vehicle. And that's really it for the post-war modifications. Outside of that, what you see here with the remainder of the vehicles, basically how the vehicle would have looked like in its World War II configuration. So now let's go ahead and look over some of the other fine details that are found on this vehicle. And these are details that are found on most of the Sherman tanks, as well as some other things that stood out to me that, well, I feel are a bit noteworthy. Well, bouncing back to the rear plate takes us to the Little Joe auxiliary generator. The generator itself, as we know, is located in the fighting compartment, and on the M4A3 would have had an external conduit that runs along the sponson and emits right there at the rear of the vehicle. The exhaust is just a simple oval tube, but one thing that I found interesting was that on this example, and I've also seen on several other examples, how the tube is just a simple tube and it just ends abruptly at the rear of the vehicle. On some other examples of the M4A3, I've seen that the piece has a little gooseneck to it, much along the lines as you see on the main exhaust. But it's interesting to see one in the flesh where, it's just a simple tube that exits out of the vehicle. One other thing that caught me off guard was on the front portion of the exhaust, and pardon the pun, but there is a guard present on this piece here. Makes total sense. Obviously, stuff is going to be drug up by the tracks and can easily damage this bit of equipment, so they have this small little steel guard welded in place, and that should, I presume, do a good job with preventing any sort of damage happening to the generator exhaust. On the topic of guards, here you can see right over the rear idler, there is this angled steel plate that is welded to protect it from any sort of stuff brought up by the idlers. Hopping rearward takes us to the tow hitch and the tow hitch mount. One thing that I was always confused and puzzled of on the Shermans, specifically these later variants, was with this little bit of equipment found right here on the tow hitch mount. As you can see, there's a small little plate that can pivot open, and there's actually a provision for a chain retained pin to keep it in place. Now, to this date, I have no idea what the actual function of this component is. It's one of those Sherman mysteries that's been eluding me for all this time. But if anyone out there in YouTube land knows what the purpose is, feel free to put that in the comment section listed below. Moving further brings us to the actual tow hitch, and you'll notice that this one here is mounted upside down, and this is something that I have seen on several real examples of Sherman tanks over the years, and it's just an interesting quirk for reasons that, again, I'm not really sure why they do that, but again, it is something that's not uncommon to see. Moving upward takes us to the under rear shelf, and this is a bit of detailing that I frequently mention in my videos that's absent and missing on most of the kits that are on the market. The Tamiya M4A3 and the Tegan and Henlong renditions also come to mind. You'll notice that there are those three little fasteners that are found in that little row over there. Those are there to secure the radiators in place, which on this vehicle are absent, as are basically most of the interior components for the engine compartment. Panning the camera, you can see the flip grille, which on this example is tucked into the stowed state. This is there so that it can deflect the amount of air that comes out of the radiators, and it prevents the cloud of dust being kicked up from the rear portion of the vehicle. When the vehicle is getting its maintenance done, this section can pivot upward and tuck into that little cubby area that you see right here. This is done so you can get access to the engine hatch, which is found on the rear portion of the hull, which is a really easy way to get back there, and is actually how I was able to film all the footage that you see right now in these two videos. On this particular example, the grille has been permanently welded in the closed or the stowed position. Normally there would be this little latch that would secure the unit into the position that you see it here. There are still some remnants left of the latch mechanism, and you can see that right now with that little tube that's built into the grille. In order to actually physically move and pivot the grille into the stowed state, the grille has a built-in retractable handle that's found right here, tucked away into the right-hand side of the grille. Also, the grille is in phenomenal shape on this example. The little lever is still fully functional, as you can see with me playing with it right now on screen. The lever is held in place when not in use with this really robust spring steel clip that's built into the grille, and basically when the piece is not being used, it just snaps into place and it keeps it there without any problems of it falling or flopping around when the vehicle's in operation. One other thing I want to mention about this grille is that the one on this example is the World War II pattern unit. There are lots of M4A3s out there that are in a similar type of condition, being, upgraded in the 50s, where the original grills were replaced and they swapped them out with the larger two-piece grills that are generally found on M4A3 E8s. Those grills flip outward as opposed to inward like the World War II example. Also, the ones that flip outward have this turnbuckle system where you can strap them to the exterior of the vehicle, and I guess it made it easier as opposed to this one where you have to tuck it in. But regardless, this is something to be aware of if you're modeling an example of an M4A3 Sherman. One other little bit of hidden detailing that I want to mention that's not talked about in any sort of detail book or on any YouTube video is exactly how do the side skirts get affixed to the side of the vehicle. As we know, Shermans have a small little perforated rail that's welded to the side of the hull, and this has the provisions on how you secure the side skirts. But exactly how are they secured on? You bolt them on, but is there going to be a loose nut or fastener on the inside? Well, that's not the case. On the inner portion of the strip, there are these pre-threaded bosses that are welded onto the inside, so that when it comes time for fastening on the side skirts, the only thing you need to do is just bolt them on, and you don't have any loose fastener running around on the inside. It's a clever design, and again, it's one that no one really thinks about, nor is it something that's really ever documented or covered in any other medium. But in case now you ever wanted to know exactly how it's done, now you have your answer. While here, might as well talk about the running gear, and there's really nothing too much to discuss. The running gear is pretty much standard VVSS. I will say, though, that the condition of the rubber components, namely on the track and the wheels, are in phenomenal condition. I mean, the tires didn't even have a single chip on them, which is something that is not typically seen. Generally, you see these things that are kind of beaten up, but on this one here, you know, these things could easily pass for a new old stock. The track, I was able to actually play with it a little bit, move it up and down, and the hinges are in fantastic shape, and if this thing wanted to, it can roll without any problems. Come to think of it, there was one thing on the VVSS that did surprised me, and something that I haven't seen on other variants or other examples of the suspension type in the past, and that is with the way it secures to the hull. As we know, the VVSS bolts to the side of the vehicle with a series of fasteners, but on the top there are these two fasteners that are found in the sunk-in wells that are integrally casted into the VVSS housing. Well, when I first saw those, I always figured, you know, this design leads to some problems because of this little bathtub nature. It's going to fill up with water and muck pretty quickly, and, you know, that can cause problems over time. Well, on this particular example, this was taken care of because on the side inner portions, you can see a little oval limber hole that is present. This limber hole here obviously is put there to drain out any sort of fluid or water that builds up into this area, and it's something that I'm probably going to be making in addition to on my 1/6 scale VVSS housing sets. Jumping back to the idler, nothing really much to talk about here, except on this particular example, you'll see that the hubcaps that cover up the inner bearings are missing, and if you ever wanted to know what's inside of a Sherman rear idler wheel axle, well, there you go. One thing that did stick out at me, though, about the rear idler wheel was exactly how it's manufactured. You can see that the piece is made from steel stampings. However, it's not just one steel stamping. The outer portion on the left-hand side here is a separate ring that is welded on, and you can see that when you look at the wheel from the side, you'll notice a weld bead running along this portion here. Hopping to the sprockets were, you know, your standard VVSS sprockets, but one thing that I found interesting was that both of these sprockets are not the same. The one on the left-hand side has a different center spindle compared to the one on the right-hand side. This is noticeable if you look at it from the inside. One of them has the support ribs that you can see right here, while the one on the opposite side, it's from a different foundry, and you'll see that the piece is ribless. This is just an example of how many foundries were creating these components, and in many cases, many of these foundries were not using the same type of plans, or they would modify them slightly in order to fit their manufacturing process. While on the front of the vehicle, it takes us to the transmission, and the transmission is the single-piece late pattern of transmission cover. One thing that I noticed that was missing on basically every single model I've seen out there is with the under portion. While I was under the tank and photographing and documenting the lower area, I noticed that there were these two blisters found on the lower portions of the transmission cover. I'm not sure to what the purpose of these blisters are, but this is something that I haven't seen rendered on any of the models that are out there in basically every scale. Another thing that caught my eye on the transmission, and it's honestly something that when I saw it I actually started laughing, was with the way the transmission was secured to the vehicle. Alright, if we take a look at this side here, you'll see, you know, the row of fasteners that come down the side of the hull and secured to the transmission. Also on the bottom portion you can see the flange continuing, and then on the opposite side the remainder of the fasteners go and move their way from bottom to top. Well, on this side here, you'll notice something a little bit goofy going on with the fasteners, and something that's not typical, and it's actually something that shouldn't be. And if you haven't caught it yet, well, that's because the fasteners on this side of the vehicle are actually mounted inside out. With the way the fasteners are supposed to be secured, you have the nut on the inside of the vehicle and then the fastener head on the outside. But at some point in time, this vehicle must have had some transmission work done to it, so the transmission was removed, and when the new unit was put in place, whoever was putting on the fasteners either didn't care or didn't know, and they put the fasteners on this one side in reverse. I'm pretty sure I can make a joke right now about the state of the people in the Army National Guard or in the Army Reserves, and by the way, it's just a joke. Having said that, I'm pretty sure I have some reservists and or National Guardsmen right now probably shaking their head and laughing because they probably know what I'm talking about. And by the way, this is something that's not exclusive to military vehicles. I have seen on several bulldozers and other pieces of heavy equipment, like for instance on our Caterpillar, the one unit for the stick shift was mounted on in reverse. So stuff like this does happen quite often, but again, when you see it, it is something that's kind of funny, and it was, to me, it was definitely something that was noteworthy to mention. One last thing about the transmission is that there is a sealant that is placed from where the transmission makes contact with the body in order to seal it off, I guess, from moisture, and it appears to be this red Permatex type gasket material. You can see it gooped around the edge over there, and matter of fact, on the top portion, you can see the paint chipping off of it, and it's that red Permatex gasket stuff that is seen on many, many vehicles that are from that era and even really up till today. And moving up from the transmission area takes us to the side hull where you see the tank's serial number. The number is stamped directly into the side plate over here. Sometimes the serial numbers are also stamped on the rear tow hook that's found on the rear hull, but on this one, it's found right there in the upper left-hand corner of the vehicle. The A prefix, from what I was able to read on the internet, claims that this is confirms that this is a Fisher-built M4A3 Sherman, and the A prefix signifies that it had the 75mm gun from its onset. As time went on, many vehicles were converted to M4A3E8, and you can tell if it was a conversion or not by if it has that A prefix found on the serial number. Jumping back to the rear deck takes to the rear engine hatches, and one thing I wanted to point out was that the engine hatches that are found in this vehicle here are the original World War II pattern of engine hatches. The World War II pattern of A3 hatches had these 4 small hinges that were used to connect the hatch to the tank and allows it to pivot open. Well, the system worked, but one of the drawbacks, or one of the complaints that the designers got back from the field, was that the hatches, because of their weight, were really, really heavy and labor intensive to open them up. So in the post-war years, they redesigned the hinge system where it had this torsion bar system that was mounted to the hatch, and this aided with the hatches open and closing. Well, several vehicles with the 75mm gun were retrofitted to have this feature on them. However, this vehicle here still, for whatever reason, kept the original World War II pattern of hatch. And also, while on the hatches, you can see what a real M4A3 rear engine hatch looks like. This is something that's very hard to render in small scale, and a lot of people, they get the wrong idea on what these hatches actually look like. If you look at a small scale model, you would think that the hatch gratings are these blocks or these other like type of machined recesses into the piece. In actuality, the hatch is actually very, very crude. They're nothing more than slats of steel that are actually pretty wide, and they descend into the engine compartment. And for the bars that go across, again, if you look at a model, you're just going to see these rectangular pieces going from left to right, but on the real vehicle, you can clearly see that what you would think is a bar is nothing more than a weld bead that runs from left to right. And trying to render this in small scale is very difficult, but it's funny when you see this trying to be done in larger scale, they tend to keep that, and frankly, it looks too well made. These engine hatches were very crude in real life, and you can see that here from the example right in front of us. One thing that I noticed when I saw the vehicle in person, and you could probably see it on the upper left-hand corner where the taillight cluster is that at some point in time, this vehicle had some repairs done to that section. If you look closely, you can see a weld bead that runs along the rear wall, and it goes around the taillight and enters into the sidewall of the armor plate. This is something that is not typical, and this illustrates that at some point in time this vehicle was damaged. Now, if this was damaged in combat or not during World War II, I don't know, but I can tell you for a fact that that area doesn't really get damaged all that often. So it was kind of interesting to see that type of weld bead found in that location. Something else that surprised me on this vehicle was with the location of the center filler cap. On every single model that's out there, you'll see this piece rendered directly dead center on the middle of the plate. Well, as it turns out, that's not the case. This piece here is quite clearly canted to the left, and this is something that I guess I'm going to be taking note of on future builds. Moving to the roof of the turret, nothing really much to talk about over here, although it was fun to getting on top of a turret of a Sherman. All of the components are basically just frozen in place, either with paint or just with layers of corrosion, rust, or even just welds. The hatch is padlocked shut, so I wasn't able to get inside of this thing. But one thing that I did notice was with the smoke grenade launcher. The smoke grenade launcher on the 75mm turreted Shermans was always something that was going in and out even during the war. The tank originally had the unit present, but then they decided to get rid of them, and then they brought them back, and then they got rid of them again, and then it just waffled back and forth. On this particular example, the turret had it at one point, but at some point they decided to eliminate it. And on this particular example, the way it was eliminated was by taking a piece of steel plate and just welding it over that area in a patch. I've seen other examples where the piece was plugged with a actual steel plug, and then they welded that up. And I've seen some examples where they just welded up just with weld beads. So there are lots of different ways this section here was dealt with. However, I've even seen examples where the smoke grenade launcher was kept in its original format. So if you're wondering whether or not your vehicle gets the smoke grenade launcher, honestly, it's really up to you. With all things considered, the components that are found on the turret were actually in pretty decent shape. Some fared better than others. The storage for the 50 caliber receiver and even the pedestal base for the 50 caliber were in really, really good shape. The travel lock for the 50 was another component that fared very well. The piece was all there. The only thing missing was the little spring clip, as that more than likely just rotted out over time. The same thing was also true for the storage clips for the barrels that are found, again, on the rear bustle section. The gunner's optic box was there partially. The sidewalls were there, but the armored roof section was missing. The vane sight was in pretty rough shape, and half of it was just cracked off at some point in the vehicle's life. But this is something that's not too uncommon. I've seen this on several surviving examples of Shermans. These vane sights are a really snag-prone piece, and the damage that you see on it, it's something that's definitely not uncommon. One bit of detailing that was absent on the roof of this one was the provisions for mounting the searchlight, and that's something that to me I found pretty interesting. Probably one of the weirdest quirks that I saw on the turret was with the shell ejection port hatch. On this particular example, whoever foundry casted this component, they had a gigantic casting sprue point right there on the face of the hatch, and you can see where there's this huge circle just integrally molded on. That was something that stood out to me. And another thing that stood out to me was the quality of casting found on the front mantlet. If you look here, you'll see this seam line that runs across this portion of the mantlet, and this is where the two seam halves connect, where the molds were joined before they poured the metal in. And one thing that gave me a little bit of a chuckle was that if I would have had this in a resin casting, like if the molds lined up like that and that piece would have been present, I'm pretty sure I would have been hearing some complaints from the customer about that, how that's a poor quality casting because the mold heads didn't line up. One other thing about the turret that stood out to me was with the blister that's found near the commander's cupola hatch. This is generally a feature that I've seen more common on 105mm Shermans, less so on tanks with the 75. Having said that, obviously there were several vehicles with this configuration of turret, so it was a real treat to see one in person. Outside of the turret, there's nothing really much to go into. The front does have some details on it, but nothing really that's that noteworthy. The one thing that did catch my eye was that the tarpaulin mount for the Bout M1919, there are normally little clips that are found along the bar stock over there around the edge, so you can clip on the canvas tarpaulin to protect the machine gun. Those clips are long gone. They more than likely just cracked and broke off during, installation removal of the tarpaulin. The headlights are completely crushed and smashed. The siren's non-existent. The only thing that's left is just the rear mounting bracket that would have been originally spot welded to the rear of the siren. And, the periscope covers. Some of the periscope covers on the bow hatches were present. They were just left in the open position. Obviously, the periscopes are gone. Most of the other periscope covers on this vehicle were just pieces of steel that were welded over the little hole area, just, I guess, prevent, stuff from getting in. And that's really all there is to it. The front's pretty much uneventful other than some of the things that I mentioned before. And it's that time of the video where I say, if you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being, well, not so much this particular video here, but my usual content, which consists of real military vehicle walkarounds, scale model builds, as well as also large-scale project update videos when they get posted. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular tank, as well as the other small, large-scale models that are frequently posted on this channel, as well as all the other real military vehicles that I've done walk-around videos and documentation for. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. And with that, I'll catch you guys all again on the next one.